Good afternoon. I'm Dina Mansour. I am on the Presidential Lecture Series Committee this year, which is chaired by Dr. Rob Saldin, and we're joined by Professor Elizabeth Dove of the School of Art. I have to tell you, we're going to start a little late, but how lucky we are, because David was flying in today, was supposed to arrive at 1:30, and he arrived at 3. So, so we're pretty lucky that he's making it this afternoon. We're just waiting for him to speed up from the airport, and he should be here any minute. So I'm just going to say a few words to talk to you a little bit about our philosophy with the Presidential Lecture Series this year. We are so honored that Dr. Richard Drake is really the one that founded and built the Presidential Lecture Series, and we're so honored to work on the framework that he provided for us. This year, the lecture series is shrinking a little bit. We're going to have 5 speakers this year. We have David Brooks today. We have Cheryl Strayed, the author of the book Wild, which is also a movie. She will be here on October 15th. And we have 3 really exciting speakers for spring. So we're just nailing down the details for them, and we will be announcing them in October, but also of national renown and really exciting for the Western Montana community. So look for that announcement. You know, we've been so excited to have President Bodnar here with us at the University of Montana, and one of our focuses this year with the Presidential Lecture Series is to bring people who are of interest to the broader Montana community. So certainly a benefit to UM faculty, students, and staff here, and enhancing our academic curriculum here, but also to engage people that are well known by Montanans and provide another one in a series of benefits that we provide to our community here. So certainly if you have any ideas for other speakers you'd like to see, we are starting early on the 2019 series. We have created an email, which is PLS for Presidential Lecture Series, pls@umontana.edu. So we welcome your feedback on today's event. We welcome your thoughts on speakers that we can bring in. We're looking for a wide diversity of speakers and interests. So we all thank you for coming. This room is actually much larger than the one we have traditionally used for the afternoon series, but we didn't want to go too large because we didn't want to detract from the evening event at the Wilma tonight, which will be a different talk. So we encourage you, if you're so compelled by his comments this afternoon, to join us this evening as well. And I want to commend you all for being here on time. We have an overflow of probably about 50 to 100 people in the ballroom right now. So they have arrived. They should be here momentarily. So soon I'll invite Dr. Albert Borgman to introduce David Brooks. So thank you all for coming.
Welcome to the Student Faculty Seminar of the Presidential Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. It's my privilege this afternoon and a great pleasure to introduce David Brooks. Most of you, I'm sure, know him, and you will know more about him this evening when at 7:30 in the Wilma Theater, he will talk about the cultural revolution we need. And as you know, David Brooks is an author and a columnist for the New York Times, a columnist of wide interests and wide reading, as are many columnists. But I think what sets him apart, that in his columns, there are always 2 questions discernibly in the background. The first being, what is the good life? And the second being, what is the good society? And I'm sure you'll see that question in the background this afternoon when David Brooks will talk about educating the whole person. Please join me in welcoming David Brooks.
Thank you. It's a true pleasure. I've done public speaking for 25 years. This is the first time I've ever been late, so I apologize. But it's not always easy to get here, but but it's a pleasure to be here. When I was 12, my father was a professor at NYU, and he had a job search. He was looking for a new job. And one of the places he had two finalists that he was considering, one outside of Philadelphia and one in Bozeman. And he chose Philadelphia, but I've always wondered, who would I be if I'd grown up in Bozeman instead of, but weirdly, this is my favorite state, and this part of the state is my favorite part of my favorite state. So, I say the same thing in Bozeman, so I'll just talk for about, I'm going to reminisce, and then I'm going to talk. It seems like I'm talking all day. I made the mistake for my first book of reading it myself for books on tape, and when you do that, you realize how boring your book is. But I did get a story out of it, which is there was another writer, a novelist, who had written a 700-page novel, and he decided to read it all for books on tape. And he's in the middle of it, and the sound engineer looks in, and he's weeping in the studio. And the sound engineer pushes the button, say, "Can I help you? Can I help you?" And the author says, "Don't I ever shut up?" And so I'm gonna be like that. So I'm gonna reminisce a bit about my college and really talk about what my college did for me. And I don't know if you're like me, but I think a lot of us are. I feel more influenced by my teachers now at age 57 than I did at 22. And what they do is they sort of plant seeds. So I'm going to talk about that. I went to the University of Chicago, where a guy named Norman McLean went. And so what Chicago did for me, my favorite saying, this bad saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite saying, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And that's more appropriate. And the college then, now a lot of higher universities have what they call the research ideal. They decide they're going to educate people by dividing their subjects into smaller and smaller specialties. And then they study that specialty. And for a lot of researchers, that's a great way to gather knowledge. But as a colleague of mine at Yale, Tony Kronman, says, one of the things it does is it makes it harder to ask the questions about the whole of your life, because everything's divided up. It makes those questions seem unprofessional. And so the college where I teach is very good at teaching people how to do things, not really good at how. And before there was the research ideal, which now governs a lot of big universities, there was a thing called the humanistic ideal. And the humanistic ideal thought the university's job was to do a few things: teach a student to earn a living, teach a student to be a good citizen, teach a student to understand the good life, and understand the nature of human beings. It's basically to mold character. J.F. Roxborough was a headmaster at a place called the Stowe School, and back in the 20s, he was asked the purpose of his institution, and he said it was to create young men who were, quote, acceptable at a dance, invaluable in a shipwreck. And that's a nice balance of things that they should be there for. And basically what the schools in the humanistic ideal did was to hold up ideals. Richard Livingston, who was a 19th century educator, said, "One is apt to think of moral failure as due to weakness of character. More often it is due to an inadequate ideal." People don't know what kind of life they should be shooting for. And so there was a Spartan educator 3,000 years ago who said, "I make honorable things pleasant to children." And that's a good description of what the University of Chicago tends to do and what humanistic institutions tend to do. And I would say back in my day, there were still some of the old refugees from World War II. A lot of the Germans who had to flee Germany came over and studied here. And they burned with enthusiasm for the great books. And they said, if you read the great books, the key to life and the key to living a good life are in these great books. And I don't remember much about what they taught me, but I remember the fervor with which they believed this. And I remember they seemed incredibly impressive to me. And one of them was a guy named Karl Weintraub. And Karl Weintraub was German, spoke with a thick German, Henry Kissinger-type accent. And he taught a friend of mine named Carol Quillen, who's now president of Davidson. And he taught her, and he was the legendary teacher in our school. And toward the end of his life, he wrote Carol an email about what it was like to teach and some of his frustrations, frankly, with the students. And he wrote to her, "Teaching seems to confront me all too often with moments when I feel like screaming at the students, 'Oh God, my dear student, why cannot you see this matter is a real, real matter? often the matter of a very being for the person, for the historical men and women you were looking at or supposed to be looking at. He's pouring himself out, and the students aren't really taking it that seriously. I hear these answers and statements that sound like mere words, mere verbal formulations to me, but they do not have the sense of pain or joy or accomplishment or worry about them that they ought to have if they were truly taking this seriously. The failure of the speaker to probe for the open wounds and such behind the text makes me increasingly furious. Sometimes when I've spent an hour or more pouring all my enthusiasm and sensitivities into an effort to tell these stories in the fullness in which I see and experience them, I feel drained and exhausted. I think it works on the student, but I do not really know. And so one of the tragedies of being a teacher is that sometimes you pour more into the class than the students are able to receive. But it's like planting seeds. When life begins happening, those seeds begin to bear fruit. And that's the way I think of my education. I think of it as a radicalism. People think Western Civ, great books education, is so stuffy and conservative and reactionary. But to me, it remains my radicalism, because capitalism and the meritocracy push us towards success, a certain version of happiness. Whereas Western Civ and the great books, Aristotle, Kant, George Eliot, they teach in the exact opposite direction. They give you an ethos that goes against the natural ethos. And so what did my teachers give me? And what do they give us? And what do great teachers give students? First, they welcomed us into a tradition of scholars. We were little peons at the end of a long conversation that stretched back centuries, and we were barely worthy to be in the room, but we were part of the great conversation, part of a long tradition. Second, they introduced us to the range of history's great moral ecologies. We tell our students to come up with your own worldview. This, like so much of what we give them, is completely garbage advice. If your name is Nietzsche or Aristotle, maybe you can come up with a worldview. Most of us need to borrow it. But fortunately, our ancestors and the ancestors all around the world have left us these great moral traditions. There's the classical tradition that values honor and courage, the Hebraic tradition that values obedience to law, the Christian tradition that values salvation and grace, the rationalist tradition that believes in logical thought, Burkean conservatism, Gnosticism, Romanticism, Buddhism, Confucianism. Each moral ecology has its own order of values, its own disputes, the things it prizes and the things it doesn't. And they gave us a chance to sample them all and see which fit. It took me a long time to figure out that the book I hated most in college was going to be the defining book of my life, which is a book called The Reflections on the Revolution of France by Edmund Burke, which is a certain sort of conservatism. The third thing humanistic institutions do for their students is to teach them to see. Now, you would think seeing well is straightforward. You just look out the world and see. But I work in politics most of the time, and I can tell you that most people don't know how to see. They see what their pride tells them to see, what their partisanship tells them to see. They see biases. John Ruskin, a 19th century critic, said, "The more I think of it, I find this conclusion more impressed upon me, that the greatest thing a human soul ever does is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see." And so how do you learn to see? You learn from the masters. Tolstoy had this great scene in Anna Karenina where he's got a 17-year-old girl putting on a velvet choker, doing her hair, putting on her dress, and feeling just incredibly beautiful. I don't know how middle-aged Tolstoy understood what it feels like, but he had the ability to see and observe and to describe it in a straightforward way. I tell all my students to read George Orwell and C.S. Lewis. These are both two mid-century English writers who wrote for radio. They wrote for clarity, to be heard, not to be read. And that's describing something in the clearest possible way. The fourth thing the professors did was they taught us how to think. Again, that seems obvious, but thinking well and the virtues that go in with thinking well are tricky. First, there's curiosity. A lot of students have what they call assignable curiosity. If you tell them to be interested in something, they'll go dutifully be interested in that thing. But our professors had such a passion for knowledge, they encouraged us just to wander around the Regenstein, our library, and just wander the stacks. And I barely did homework in college, but I spent hours wandering the stacks, and that was my education. There's courage. Intellectual courage, part of that is involved in holding an unpopular opinion. But part of it is knowing, with the evidence, how far you can leap ahead. Not too much courage, you leap to generalizations that are unmerited. Too little, you're just timid. There's humility. To me, the best definition of humility is not thinking lowly of yourself. To me, the best definition of humility is radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. It's the ability to step outside yourself and see your strengths and see your weaknesses. And my whole worldview, borrowed from Edmund Burke, is epistemological modesty. Epistemology is a study of what we know, and modesty is modesty. It's the basic idea the world is super complicated, more complicated than we can possibly imagine. So you should do change incrementally, slowly, and cautiously, as Burke says, as if you're operating on your own father. Gradual, cautious. And so the final thing they gave us, or the next thing they gave us, is emotional knowledge. I saw Taylor Swift on TV on 60 Minutes a few years ago, and somebody pointed out to her that a lot of her songs are sad songs. And Taylor Swift said, well, you have to understand there are 21 different kinds of sadness. There's your dog dies sadness, and she plays a certain sort of song. There's your boyfriend dumps you sadness, a different song. Your mom is mad at you sadness, different song. Taylor Swift is an expert at sadness. We're born with these very simple emotional memory or concepts, but then through art and through life, we learn to differentiate them. And so there are now 21 different kinds of sadness. Who would want to go through life only really feeling one kind when you could have 21? Or joy. And so how do you get that? I think you get it in sharing the emotional experience of art. When you walk with Whitman as he exults in the joy of himself, with Antigone as she struggles to bury her brother, with Galileo as he follows his discoveries, with Pascal as he feels the presence of God, with Sylvia Plath as she descends into madness. That's not to have new information, that's to have a new experience. And it's to feel along with the author and to suffer a feeling that you've never felt before. Most of us in this room are white, but if you read this, the invisibility that Ralph Ellison feels, then you could get some sense of what that's like. And so that is to widen your emotional knowledge, to widen your repertoire of knowledge. The sixth thing Chicago did, it reordered our desires and gave us new things to love. To me, this is the core thing that universities should do, give you new things to love. You come into school, you sort of know yourself, you know your family, you know your town, you spend a lot of time thinking about your own reputation. But you should be presented with a field of research, a hobby, a craft that just takes your breath away. Plato understood this 2,000 years ago. Plato said, if you want to teach somebody, start by teaching them a beautiful face. And then when they see that beauty, they'll realize, well, the face is beautiful, but there's a higher beauty than that, which is a beautiful personality. And when they see a beautiful personality, they think, well, there's an even higher beauty than that, which is a beautiful society, which is justice. And when they see justice, they'll think, oh, but there's even a higher beauty than that, which is truth. And when they see that, they'll see an even higher beauty, which is the transcendent beauty of the universe from which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. And that, for Plato, was God. And so he said, when you educate somebody, take advantage of their natural desire for beauty. The Greek word for beauty is call. Beauty calls us. And so our professors gave us all those sorts of different desires. And in this way, it did the ultimate thing, which is to teach us what is worth wanting. We all love a lot of things. And you could say we love material things, material pleasure. The second, we like ego, gratification of status. But then you could say we also love generativity, the pleasure we get from giving back from others. We love emotional fusion and love. And then finally, we love transcendence, the feeling that our life is oriented to some ultimate truth. The ego is naturally satisfied with the first two. But to develop the capacities for the last three is the hard part. And we all get our loves out of order a lot of the time. If a friend tells you a secret and you blab it at a dinner party, you're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship. And that's getting your loves out of order, and that's sin. And so what the university did, what has introduced us to all these great things, And we fell in love with them. I remember once I was in this library and I was assigned Nietzsche, a writer I don't particularly like or understand anymore, but I was smarter back then. And I started reading this book called The Death of Tragedy like at 7:30. And suddenly I looked up from the book and it was 11. And I don't remember any of the time passing. I was just in the book. I was like, his prose is kind of psychedelic. And when you have an experience like that, it's hard to be satisfied reading trash. And when you have experiences like I saw with my professors, it's hard to live the kind of shallow life that some of us are naturally inclined to. Once you've tasted the pure wine, you don't want to go back to the Kool-Aid. And so that kind of thing just leaves a residue and gives you a moral vocation to be dissatisfied with an inferior life. And I didn't know if I learned much at Chicago, but I learned that power of dissatisfaction. And so whatever my flaws, I've spent my life trying to learn more every day and trying to live up to the ideals that were planted. And that was just the big gift. And so what was great about Chicago, and great about all schools that do this, is that they didn't divide me to a brain on a stick. What I've described to you is a process of really educating the heart more than the head. And people think of Chicago as a super brainy place. But what humanistic liberal arts institutions like this one do is really, it's more about educating the heart, which we don't like to talk about, some of us, because we're middle-aged white men. And we don't talk about that stuff. But you have to go there to understand what's really happening in a place like this. Thank you. I hope I've left time for us to talk about Paul Manafort or whatever else you want to talk about. Right here.
You talked about Burkean instrumentalism. How should Burkean incrementalists deal with a disaster?
Yeah.
This university is in a disaster. It's been losing enrollment year after year. Does gradualism, does incrementalism tell us how to deal with reversible disasters?
Well, I can't speak to the situation of this university. I've been. Sure, the question is, the gentleman said that this university has been losing enrollment for year after year, and so it's in a disaster state. And so does Burkean incrementalism, do incremental solutions, are they right for something when things are going radically off the rails? I can't speak. I've been here 20 minutes, so my my expertise is deep. When I was a foreign correspondent, I would say if I go to a country in 4 days, I've got it all figured out. But if I stay 5 or 6, it starts getting a little murky. So I would always cut it off. It's better to be clear and wrong than complicated. I will only say a few things. Liberal arts colleges are under pressure these days. But I've described what is the good. I'm going to talk more about this tonight. But in my view, we're not motivated primarily for money. I rarely meet people who are really primarily motivated for money. We're primarily motivated for meaning, for a sense of meaning. We want to lead a good life. I've never met anybody who didn't want to lead a good life. And how do you lead a good life? How do you know what a good life is if you haven't thought deeply about why questions? I teach at Yale, as I say, I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And my students are amazing. You know, I ask them, what are you doing across spring break? It's like, I'm going to unicycle across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're doing amazing things. They have an amazing ability to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. But they get out of school, and at 25 or 26, something bad happens to them. They get fired, a romantic breakup, something, and they call me and they've cratered. And why? Nietzsche has a phrase, if he who has a why can endure any how. If you know why you're living, you can endure the hows. But if you don't know your why, when bad things happen, you crater. And you can only get the why at a place like this. So arguing against that cultural tide seems to me the task here. And to me, when I look at the young people I'm around a lot, their spiritual hunger is vast and deep. And the problem, in my view, with a lot of the humanities and liberal arts is they tried to get in the business of fixing society when they should be in the business of deepening souls. And every student I know longs for that. And so I would just say, Burkean or not, returning to the roots of why this tradition's been around for 2,000 or 3,000 years is the key strength, and believing in that mission.
However, in your column after a president's performance at Helsinki, you were in despair. You were saying that tradition is coming to an end, the U.S.-European relationship. Is the situation hopeless?
Okay. The question was more about the political situation, what Trump is doing to the Western alliances, and the question was, is it hopeless or really bad? Or, or even worse than hopeless. Cultural underpinnings. Yeah, I think about this a lot, like how much damage is being done to our norms. And I guess I would say two things. I still don't think we're in as bad a situation as in 1968 or 1932. There are certain moments where we have a culture and it works for us for a time, but then it stops working for a lot of people and they chop it up. And at those moments, the same problem hits different countries all around the world. 1848 was like that. There were labor's unrest everywhere in the world. 1968 was like that. 1905 was like that. And those are really bumpy moments as we chop up the old order. But people are ingenious and they figure a way to figure things out. And so there's a theory called the ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet theory of social change. That you create a culture or you create a new paradigm and you advance. It stops working, hatchet, really ugly period, pivot, ratchet up again because people figure stuff out. And so I think we're in a ratchet phase. But there's an advertisement for tonight. I've spent the last year going around the country looking at social renewal in community after community. And it's happening all around the country. The answers to all our problems are already happening all around the country. The question is just how do we nationalize it? There's a phrase in the book of Job called, "And the sparks fly upward." And so to me, the solutions will happen locally and eventually fly upward. But they're not going to happen top down in Washington. But I am short-term very pessimistic, long-term hopeful. Which is generally easy about life in the red.
Yes, if I may follow the first question. You're speaking mostly about an elite education which is kept alive from Los Angeles, Pomona to Yale, etc. But the problem is that, as you know, the new form of capitalist production in conjunction with the digital era is putting an undue pressure on humanities. That means that humanities and critical learning, critical thinking, which is the hair of continental theory and the Frankfurt School, is denied to the masses. This is very serious. And this is happening here. We are in a very acute situation. So my question is, if you allow me, and we finish, do you think that there are a lot of texts, like Bill Readings, Sandy Cohen, Hitchens? It seems to me that the so-called liberal class in America, and the Democrats Party also, have betrayed this, as you say, idealistic dimension of education. There's a few protests, the New York Times here and there, but the system, the political system, the intellectuals are letting the situation deteriorate in the name of utilitarianism, functionalism, money. Administrators are being counters now. So I would like you to address that.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. Okay, next question. What happened was, in 1950, Harvard accepted, they decided we can't be a school for rich boys. So they said, let's up the SAT scores and we'll just hire the smartest. And we had a system based on intelligence and academic excellence. If we were building a society, we would want to also value people who are really good at building relationships. But we prioritized one sort of person, analytical ability, and we did it in a way that was philosophically wrong. we adopted a sort of Cartesianism that the brain is separate from the body and the brain is separate from the heart. And we reduced people to analytics. And the schools became places of analytics. And they became de-emotionalized and de-eroticized and demoralized. And I would say in general, in our political culture, we're over-politicized and under-moralized. And so we don't talk about these things, and as a result, people, and especially young people, are lost with what you could call a telos crisis. They don't know what their purpose is. And so among teenage boys in the last 15 years, the suicide rate has gone up 25%. Among teenage girls, it's gone up 70%. Our suicide rates nationwide have been climbing since 1999. And why do people commit suicide? For two reasons. One, they're lonely, and two, they don't really know the meaning of their life. And I do think that this educated class has betrayed itself, betrayed its core ideals, and also betrayed the rest of the country. But the final thing to be said is, I wrote this book called The Road to Character, and I went around the country giving talks about it at elite places, non-elite places. The hardest talks were they put me in some corporate conference center at some convention of, I don't know, insurance executives, no offense. And I'd see a bunch of 62-year-old guys in boring suits sitting there. And I'm going to talk to them about morality and George Eliot's love life and all this mushy stuff. And I would walk into the room and I'd think, this is not going to go well. But when I would talk, there was a quality of silence that I'd never heard at any other thing I spoke about, because everybody is hungry. And my book on morality, this book, The Road to Character, sold twice as much as any of my other books, just because that's where the hunger is, among all strata of society. I think it's all coming back, by the way. I think that Brene Brown, there's a lot of us who are, and a lot of people in a lot of schools, 25% of the students at Yale University are in one class, and it's on positive psychology. What's the most popular class at Stanford University, this engineering mecca? Designing your life. People are hungry for this stuff, and if you offer it to them, they flock to you.
So in your talk and in a couple of your responses now, you've mentioned this, what happens at the individual level when that cratering occurs, right? So, and I buy that. What I think a lot of us feel these days is that perhaps we're cratering at the national level, right? Kind of our national morality. And if you lose that kind of that moral bearing or azimuth at that national level, and we all know that whether it's an ecological system or an economic system, that it's so much easier to damage and destroy something than it is to rebuild something. What happens when a country like the United States craters? If it
This really is the core of what I'm talking about, so I'll give you a little pressy. What happens is trust levels collapse. It used to be people in this country, if you asked them, do you trust people around you, 60% said yes. Now it's 32% say yes, 19% of millennials. The younger you go, the more untrusting people are. And that's not perception, that's reality. It's people are less trustworthy. And so you get alienation, you get distrust, you get loneliness. And when you leave people naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, is they revert to tribe. And tribe is like community for narcissists. Because it's like, it's all us, them, we're good, they're bad. And so we're in an incredibly tribal era, because when the fabric of society wears away, that's what people revert to. And so to me, as I say, that you have to restore the fabric on the local level, on a relational level, before it can be done on national level. Our basic situation is that capitalism and the state are up here, but they rest in a bed of relationships. There has to be trusting relationships for capitalism and the state to work. There has to be certain sort of social norms. There has to be basically a fabric holding it up. And if you take away that under fabric, then capitalism and democracy begin to teeter. And I think that's where we are. And so one of the things that's been interesting to me is I go around the country and this despairing, and I ask people, what's your primary identity? Are you an American first, like John McCain who just died? He was an American first. He was not an Arizonan first. He was not a Sedonan first. That was his primary identity. That's probably mine too. But most people I meet, that's not their primary identity. Their primary identity is their town. And that's what they feel most emotionally bonded to, and that's what they want to devote their energies to. So I think we're going to recover town by town. And then the question is, how do you weave that together? And one of the things we probably need is a new national narrative. I was raised with a certain narrative, which was a Moses narrative. Our ancestors left oppression, crossed the wilderness, and came to build the promised land. And the Puritans came here with that mentality. The founders, Ben Franklin, wanted to put the Great Seal of the United States be Moses, because that was his story. That was the American story. And all the immigrants came with that story. Martin Luther King told that story more than any other story. He talked more about Exodus than about the New Testament. And that was our great unifying story. And then the sense of westward expansion and all that, a new Eden. When I talk to young people and I tell them that's our national story, they look at me like I'm crazy. They say, this is not a promised land. This is a land based on oppression and slavery and discrimination and genocide of the Indians. And so they just don't buy the story. So we need a new national story. And to me, the right story is a redemption story. It's the one contained in Lincoln's second inaugural. That was a moment which could have been a moment of great triumph. We won the war. You in the South, you caused this. You were for slavery. We were not. We were right. You were wrong. He doesn't do that. The key words in that speech are us, our, all. They're all unifying words. Slavery is not a Southern institution. It's an American institution. We all had to pay for the wages of that sin. And so it's a story of we're an experiment. We betrayed it, but we can come back and build it anew. To me, that's a more compelling story for the way people are today when they feel angry and betrayed. But finding that narrative, creating a sense of mission, is a big challenge. If you asked baby boomers when they were 22, is America the greatest country on earth? About 60% say yes. If you ask today's 22-year-olds, is America the greatest country on earth? Less than 30% say yes. So there's just been a loss of faith. And if I went on this tour around college campuses. If you're on a college campus today, what's your experience of history? The financial crisis, the Iraq War, Donald Trump? It's probably not great. Every institution you know has failed you. And so there's a great sense of distrust or betrayal. And so you can't ignore that. That's real. And so you got to deal with that.
I wonder if the two-party system, which has become a two-tribe system to a great extent, people attacking each other over how they enjoy music, beyond.
Well, I have to say, this thing with cinnamon raisin bagels and lox, that is horrible. This was as the governor of New York, Cynthia Nixon, said that's what she ate. In New York, bagels, very serious subject.
But I'm wondering if the two-party system is contributing to the divisions, the tribalism, the hatreds, and I know it's dangerous always. We're always terrified when a party arises, but if it might be the road we have the right to develop a broader range of possibility just because of the us versus them. We don't want to be the Hutus.
Yeah, I'll repeat it.
Having a third party or a fourth and fifth party could possibly help.
Right. The question is, would a third party, is that the inevitable result of all this tribalism and polarization? And I would, it's obviously the barriers to a third party are high. But first I'll describe the technocratic way you can get around that. It wouldn't work in Montana, but it would work most places, a thing called ranked choice voting. And so there's nothing in the Constitution that each congressman has its own district. You could have a district with 4 or 5 congressmen, just a bigger district. And when you go into the voting booth, you cast ballots for 2 or 3. And when you do that, Maine has just done it, and the city of Oakland, I think, has done it, a couple other places have done it, you break the two-party duopoly, because you can have a lot of people come in. And so to me, physically, that's the way you should do it. The question is, what is the philosophy of the two-party system? I'm a moderate Republican, great future. I picked a great career. I'm a moderate Republican. My heroes are Edmund Burke and Alexander Hamilton, who's if you don't know, he's a Latino hip-hop star from the Heights. And there are just not enough, there are like 6 of us left. So I always think, oh, we're in the middle, there's not much evidence that the middle has enough for a third party. And so like Michael Bloomberg thought of running, there's not much evidence that, they seem to be all the people I meet, but there's not much evidence that there's room for that. But I do think if you are running a third party, you have to be the most radical party. Not radical left or right, but to me, radical in federalism and saying Washington is just not working now. And so people at the states and the state and local level, they just should have a lot more power. And how you exactly make that work is difficult. But I will say in Congress, I know a lot of members of Congress, when I first got this job, I was told to interview 3 politicians every day. So I spent a lot of time around them, less than I used to. And I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. But they have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is talking so much they drive themselves insane. But the most unhappy people in Congress are former mayors and governors who've come to Congress. The most happy people I know are people who've left Congress and become mayors. That's just where it's working. And so that's where the solutions have to be. Let's go in the back. Ladies first.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm a grad student here, and I also am an instructor of writing. So I get to teach these awesome students, and I have the absolute best students. They are hungry for community, like you're talking about. They're hungry to learn. Their skills are fairly low. I've taught writing for years, and I'm not surprised. This is just kind of the standard right now, but our graduation rates are also very low. So how, if you have any advice from working in the university system, being a big advocate of it, how can we increase our graduation rates, because we are in a crisis here, without lowering our academic standards?
Well, I would say, first I'm going to talk about how I write. Because I do teach like just simple, clarity of writing. And the thing I tell my students is by the time you sit down at your keyboard, whatever you're writing should be 80% done. Writing is about structure and traffic management. It's not about typing into a keyboard. So I often, now it's in my notebook, I have a very bad memory. So whenever I have a thought or come across a piece of information, I write it down. And so for each column, when I'm writing a column, and I'll have like pages of notes I've written down, and then maybe 200 pages of printed material that I printed out. And I put it in piles on the floor of my living room. And each pile is a paragraph in my column. And so what do? I sort the piles into the paragraphs, and I pick up a pile, I write that paragraph, throw the paper away, go to the next pile. And so writing, for me, is not typing. It's crawling around the floor with my piles. And that's just to emphasize that it's all about structure. I'm sure you teach this, but this is just the functional way I do it. So that's my tip on writing. And also just read C.S. Lewis. I mean, just the clarity of the prose. George Orwell, he grabs you. And one of the problems with college writing is that I tell my students, right now, highly educated people are paid to read your writing. That will never happen again. And so you got to earn it. And you got to bring some information to the table, but you got to have good first sentences. George Orwell is great at first sentences. He wrote a thing about his public school days when he was a kid in a prep school. And he wrote, shortly after I arrived at Bradley's, not long, but after you think I would have gotten over it, I began wetting the bed. Oh, you want to figure that out. You can't stop reading right there. So, as for completion rates, it's obviously a problem everywhere. I would say 2 things. It's partly a problem of community in both senses. When people leave schools, they're much more likely to leave if they don't have somebody to, they hate the process of going to confess that they're leaving to somebody they truly trust and know. And so if you can build that trusting relationship, either with fellow students or with a faculty member, they just don't want to leave and say, I'm leaving. So that if they feel tightly bound in a community, then they're much more likely to complete. Secondly, the reason, in my experience, most students leave school is life happens. Illness, children, something. And so building structures around students, so when life happens, they don't have to forgo their dreams. That to me is a big social challenge we just all face. Let me go to the same area.
When you opened your talk, you spoke about great books and how they're a kind of cultural inheritance for everyone to answer the deepest questions of their lives. Would you name a few?
Some of the great books. So there's a book called the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. I counted in my senior year, I wrote 16 papers on that one book. And they all have lessons. So that book teaches you that in politics, the lows are lower than the highs are high. When a political leader does something really good, it produces a benefit for society. When they do something really bad, it's catastrophic. And so they teach you those sorts of things. I'll tell this story of, I became a fan of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's whole life was formed by this incident. He was a revolutionary in the 19th century in Russia. He got arrested by the Tsar. They were sentenced to hard labor, but then one morning they said, we've changed your sentence. It's not hard labor, it's death. We're going to shoot you today. So they dressed them in burial shrouds. They marched them out to the town square. They put them in hoods and clocked the guns. And then by pre-assigned motion from the authorities, a horse rode in and said, the Tsar is pardoning all your lives. So they looked death right in the face, and then suddenly their life was spared. And they were sentenced back to hard labor. One of the guys went crazy. One of the guys just kept screaming, long live the Tsar, long live the Tsar. Dostoevsky came back to his cell and wrote a letter to his brother, realizing that all his life he had wanted the wrong things. And then now he realized that life was about love and relationships and all that kind of stuff. And his whole rest of his life was wrestling with these things. And so one of the things that is great about these books is they are human beings. They're not like stuffy, austere figures. And they understand us more than we understand ourselves because of their greatness. And so those people just are still like ghosts in my head. And I'm sure you all have authors that you love. So I feel like we're in the age of Twitter, and believe me, I'm as addicted to Twitter as anybody. But it's just a waste. And in some senses, reading my first 2 years were all great books. My second 2 years were like reading academic theory about this and that. I remember none of the last 2 years. The great books, the books about human beings talking to each other, that's the magic I believe in. Yes?
The theme of your talk is about educating a whole person. What would be your ideal profile for such an educated whole person, and to what extent the profile you will refer to could be universal, not culture blind?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I'm hesitant to say there's one profile. I mean, I would want there to be that deep sense of wisdom. And I'm not going to talk about this too much tonight, but what I look for in people is moral joy. That there's all different kinds of joy. One of my professors was a guy named William McNeil, and he was in the Army marching. And he said, when I was marching with my troop mates, I felt this swelling out. We were all one thing. We were one marching together. And I felt this incredible expansiveness. Some people feel it in nature. They're walking, they're taking a hike somewhere, and the brambles come up and get part of them. The spider webs are in their face, and they feel a oneness with nature. And so there are all these different levels of joy. But to me, the highest joy is not just a moment. It's an outlook. And some people radiate this outlook. I'm on a lecture tour with Yo-Yo Ma, who's a cellist and a great cellist. He just is happy all the time. He's out serving. I was at a lunch a few years ago, and I was seated next to the Dalai Lama. And that guy, he didn't say anything particularly interesting, but he laughed for no apparent reason. We'd just be sitting there and he'd just start laughing. And I wanted to be polite, and I didn't know what to say to the guy, and I start laughing too, and he would laugh and I would laugh. And he just radiates that joy. And I was trying to tell jokes just to sort of put something before his laughter. And then he had a little canvas Dalai Lama bag he carries around with his stuff. And I didn't know what to say. It was really awkward. So I said, "Do you have any candy in your bag?" And he starts pulling out all stuff out of the bag. And it's basically everything you get in the first class cabin of an international flight. It's like little razor, earplugs, eye patches. But that kind of radiating joy. And how do you get that? That to me is universal. And how do you get that? I think through extended periods of moral uplift. Like you perform a good deed for somebody, you feel good about it. If you do a lifetime of good deeds, then you get that. And so to me, I think we make a mistake of aiming for happiness. Happiness is when you're really aware of yourself, you won some victory, but joy is when yourself disappears and you're lost in something else. And so to me, that would be the thing to look for. Thank you.
Yeah, you've mentioned tribalism a couple of times. In this, most of us have seen this in this currently ethnic, multicultural society. It's getting more and more so than I ever remember. Do you think it's possible, or is it worthy to try and bring along leaders both locally and nationally who would promote intellectual curiosity about the world outside of our own?
It's worth a shot. The question was about leaders who promote intellectual curiosity. You know, the fact is, if we change every immigration law now, we're just going to be a majority-minority country. That's just baked in. Starting in 2 years, our kindergartens will be that, and a few years after that, our adult will be that. And so it's hard to live in a culture as diverse as ours, but we just have to. We've got no other choice. And so figuring out how to do that. And to me, the difference, there's a guy named Miroslav Wolf at Yale who has a concept of soft differences. We're not going to go to a melting pot where we all assimilate each other and we're all alike. I come out here to Montana because culture here is very different than New York City. I didn't see a cow till I was 16. You come out here and it's like, when I'm in New York, I'm in a subway car with 250 people, I feel completely alone. When I'm out here taking a hike and there's somebody like 3 miles away, I'm like, oh, it's so crowded here. So we're just going to have to live with each other. And so we're not going to become alike. But if we have community based on love and not shared hatreds, then I don't mind that you're not in my community. You have your community, I have mine, and the differences between our communities are soft, not walls. Thank you very much.